Ah, hello. I'm Tal Smith, and today I'm doing a book review that's live. I figured I'd do something a little different, so here we go. Um, the book review is called The Ghost of Heaven. You can read it. Apparently won an award there. Prince, I guess. Yeah. Um, so the best way it's not really a novel as much as it is a collection of four different novellas, and they're kind of all over the place. So I'm just gonna like review each novelist separately and give my thoughts on it. But before I begin, I should mention that the book's central supposed theme is on spirals, so everything's supposed to be connected by this one theme of spirals, and apparently the people's different perceptions to spirals. Now, the first part of the novel is utterly brilliant, called Whispers in the Dark. It's this beautiful narrative poem, basically about the caveman days, and it's just got this nice, beautiful structure that's simple, but is rich, mixing in the context of what makes it great is in the context of the spirals. The spirals is basically this image that this cave woman basically comes up with the idea for language, or at least the concept of language, and that's utterly fascinating. And the poetic structure is really good. For example, she is the one who goes on when others remain behind, the one who walks into darkness when others cling to the light. She is the one who will step alone into the cave with fire in her hand and with fire in her head. Stuff like that is really good. In fact, that's the one positive thing, is that the poetry in here is pretty good. And yeah, this first section is just really fun and enjoyable. So, yeah, and I like how it's beautiful, but it's also simple, sort of giving into that sort of prehistoricness that he was trying to go for, the author here. So I like it very much. And then comes the second story, and this is the one I really want to get into. It's called The Witch in the Water. And this one just really pisses me off for a whole number of reasons, but the main reason is that it's cheap, lazy, half-assed propaganda. They completely undermine what causes these witch hunts to occur in olden days, but also ignores the fact of how disturbingly prevalent it is even in our modern society, despite people not wanting to admit that it is prevalent. It's incredibly prevalent, especially on the internet. Let me go into detail of the story first, and I'll explain why. The problem with the story is basically it demonizes all the men as being a bunch of sexist pricks, and in the process also has it where not only is the demonizing of all the men being sexist pricks, but the one like somewhat religious person is like the devil incarnate. It's just so blatantly obvious, and the reason it's annoying is because there's a real reason why these witch hunts occurred. And you have to understand, a whole fucking village or villages were involved in these. Men, women, children, everyone got involved. Why? Well, often because some weird shit happened. Some fear of something they didn't fully understand. A fear of the unknown, if you will. That fear of the unknown led to paranoia. That paranoia led to people jumping to conclusions. That jumping to conclusions led to people making horrible, rash decisions and leading to the worst possible mindless decision you can have, which is to have mob mentality and mob rule, which is unhealthy to say the least. And you see why that's prevalent in this day and age with the internet. The best story example dealing with witch hunts was The Crucible. And the reason why it's so prevalent was when the guy wrote The Crucible, Arthur something, I forget his last name, but when he was writing The Crucible, he was writing it while living in his own age of witch hunts. Of course, it was more of a comedy scare, but it was the same basic principles, the same fear of the unknown, the same paranoia, jumping to conclusions, everyone on each other's throat, mob mentality, craziness. That's just nonsense. And yeah, and that's why it gets so irritating when you have stories like this. And this is the second time I had to deal with this sort of story in the same year even, and it's just really infuriating how the whole this really prevalent human issue of fear of the unknown, of paranoia, of jumping to conclusions, of mom mentality, and all these things is completely undermined in these two stories I've had to deal with witch hunts just to make digs at sexist men who are all dead, by the way, and um, evil demonic priest people. It's like there was more than that going on. Whole villages weren't on that. Like there was a drought. Nobody understands why that drought happened. They wanted a scapegoat, so they blame someone for it because they do something weird like walk on one foot or something, and like, oh no, she must be a witch, or even a he, because oftentimes there's a he. And the thing that makes it even more annoying in this story is there was such an easy way they could have made the story much more caring and human and make you feel for the main character without demonizing anyone. You see, what makes it so irritating is the main girl in the second story of the witch in the water, is the fact that she follows the typical tropes of being smart, and they even get on her case about being smart for some reason. Just anyways, and they go on about all she and her mother knows these herbs and blah 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 blah, and it just isn't necessary, and it just doesn't work, especially considering we don't really the herbs don't really serve any purpose to this story. I mean, they go on about some event that happened before the story even took place, about how someone's baby died because they couldn't save him with the herbs. But again, this is just told to us after the fact, and we never actually witness it. And personally, I think the way they could have done the whole witch hunt story is much easier. And what makes it so infuriating is I was right in the story itself. You see, this one guy, the brother of the witch, if you will, he has a sickness that makes him have convulsions. Now, in our day and age, we could probably figure out what medical problem it is and go and fix it, blah, blah, blah. But back in the day, they wouldn't know that. They would think he was possessed and evil. And they even reference that he's possessed and evil, which is annoying because why wouldn't they not have tried to kill him first? But they didn't. They just tried to blame it on the girl instead, which does not make sense. If they saw a guy having convulsions, they would immediately think he was a witch or possessed or something and try to kill him. Because although there were probably more women that were hunted down in the witch hunts, there were men that were hunted down as witches too. So, especially in this case, that's why I think it would work better if what happened is this, okay? You have this sister who's overly distraught and overly wrought because her mother just died, and she has to both get a job to take care and provide for herself and his brother, while at the same time trying to take care of his brother's convulsions, while trying not to let the whole town see what the hell's going on, because they jump to conclusions and let their fear and paranoia lead to horrible, rash decision making and a mob mentality. And then, unfortunately, it eventually slips that the guy has convulsions. They try to kill him for a witch. She tries to stop them, and then she's considered a witch as well, and they try and kill her as well. See, a simple, sensible way of handling this issue. We don't need this bullshit backstory that has no prevalence in what we're reading concurrently. We don't need to demonize all the men as sexist. We don't need evil psycho priests. All we needed was people to see something they didn't understand, jump to conclusions, bring in their paranoia and fear of the unknown, and having a mob mentality, like an actual witch hunt, and voila. And that's why I'm so irritated. All the basis for what could have worked for a real witch hunt's there, but it's completely undermined. A guy that's literally mentioned as being possessed is left without being attempted to be killed in any way, which doesn't make any sense. They try to get at the woman for being smart for some reason, and it's just so sloppily handled and done. It's just a mess, and it's cheap propaganda. And it's so infuriating because the first story, it's about a cave woman that discovers language, but it's not preachy. It's not full of propaganda. It doesn't demonize everyone. What makes the first one work so much better than the second with the tribal cultures is the fact that it just lets it happen as it probably was like, and shows that it happened because of, it happened because of how nature provided our bodies different functions, and that's where the power struggles came from. It doesn't justify or anything. It just sort of shows that it happened, unfortunately, out in nature. Not that it was fair, just, that happened, and showed it as it was. And it didn't demonize anyone in the process. That's why it was so much better than the second one, where it just makes all the men evil fucking, sexist pricks. and makes it evil psycho priests and all that, does a crazy hunt for no reason. Whereas, like I said, the whole story was right there. All you needed was for her to try to, take care of providing for herself and his brother, but being overwrought and eventually letting it slip that his brother has convulsions. Then they try and kill him for being a witch. Then she tries to save him, and then she ends up being killed for being a witch too. I mean, I just don't get why they didn't do that. Anyways. And then there's the third story, which is kind of the weirdest one to get into. It's hold on, The Easiest Room in Hell. This one's just kind of all over the place. Okay, let's go over all the problems. The first thing is that we're supposed to be in an asylum in like the early 20th century, but the problem is the asylum looks too clean and pristine and mostly organized, like a modern asylum that's less like a prison. And I just think that's very contradictory when they're trying, when the so-called doctors are still treating the patients in the same way they would be treating them in the 1920s, for example. I don't know. I felt this disconnect between the so-called atmosphere of the architecture building to the so-called asylum itself, and I think it would have worked better if the asylum at least looked like something from like I don't know, like what's that? The one with the island in it. There's this movie with an island asylum thing on its own, Skelter Island or something like that. You get the idea. It should have been something a bit more dirty and rotting and messy, and that way it'd work better in context to the old mistreatment of the crazy people. That would have worked out a lot better, but they didn't. So yeah, and then there's the other problem, which is just all the annoying subplots. We have this, the problem is the story keeps focusing on the narrator, which is this boring ass doctor, and his boring ass sub story about him grieving over his dead wife, who's been dead for years, and then taking care of his daughter, who's really just there to be a damsel in distress. And then there's a whole bloody subplot about the mistreatment of the ladies in the asylum, which really goes nowhere at all, other than a reference that he's going to get rid of it, and like no point to it. And what makes it so infuriating to me is that the main story is so interesting. The main character, I should say. The main character who has the least focus for some reason. It's the poet. You have this fascinating poet who writes everything in his head. And his biggest fear is of spirals. And he's deeply mistreated by the people in the asylum. And it's utterly fascinating. But when we get a few minutes of that and then cut to boring shit drama, like, for example, the boring shit drama where the daughter is being bullied at school, which goes nowhere, by the way, other than him having some confrontation about his teacher about, hey, stop the bullying thing. And he says, uh-oh, I fear this might be trouble for her, the daughter. And it literally has no trouble in it, and this whole thing never goes anywhere, this whole subplot. So it's like, what? Why can't you just focus on the freaking crazy poet person? He's like the coolest thing in this whole story. Why do you keep sidetracking on that? And then there's the other issue is I feel that the writing structure itself is kind of off. It's written in diary passages, but I don't think it doesn't work that way. I think it should have been written in the format of like a report about the crazy poet person instead. And that would have been a bit more focused on the crazy poet instead of having all these vast subplots that go nowhere. And then there's the final one, the final novella in this thing called The Song of Destiny. And oh boy, The Song of Destiny. Okay. This is the boringest one of the bunch. It's just an arc in space story, essentially. But with one guy waking up every 10 years to check on everything. Yeah, you already heard this thing before. And it's so overwrought with babble and backstory about how the Earth has been blah 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 blah, which we don't see at all. It's just told to us through this guy. That when we finally get to the story about these people that are dying in the ark, it doesn't go anywhere. He doesn't really figure out the mystery, and half the time he just sidetracks focusing on pie. It's like a whole fucking paragraph of him just going on about pie, for fuck's sake. Also, one thing I think is rather really irritating is how come the author, who's so obsessed with spirals, didn't think it would be a cool idea to have the spiral be like this mark, this sort of like death mark that the killer left behind. I would have thought that would be cool. Like he'd kill the victim and then leave some mark there, maybe of the person's blood or something. I don't know. Just would have been interesting to add to it. But no. And it's just so overwrought with all this technobabble that the few interesting ideas there aren't even interesting. And the worst part is, the whole sub story in this one is supposed to be a fucking paradox. A paradox. We don't realize it's a paradox till towards the end, and even when we do find out, it's barely even explored or explained. It's mentioned more as a fucking ghost than as an actual paradox. And on top of that, it just changes with the one guy leaving on the ship and the other going down to this little planet. And then it ties everything together with the last lines connecting to the first subsection with the poem. And yeah, so that's the Ghost of Heaven. It's a real hot mess. The first section is still brilliant, and it was a breeze to read through, but all the other sections was just, all over the map. It's still an interesting read, though, and I do think all the poetry in it is really good and entertaining. It's just a shame that there was all this crap in between it. But yeah, that's my review on this. So see you next time.